Hi, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of Street Fight Politics that we're calling Weed Fight Politics. Why weed fight? Well, because around the country, a revolution is now taking place in the consumption, legality, and applications for both hemp and marijuana, including medical applications. As always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Harry Weed Kick Ramsbottom and Ed Weedrapreneur Westerfield. And I'm Jimmy Zuma. Tonight we have a special guest. Our first guest is Jill No. She's the founder of the Wonder Crop, company that makes and promotes hemp products, and she's host of the YouTube channel Jill Knows Hemp.
Hi, thanks.
Hi, Jill. She's a lifelong advocate of medicinal cannabis and other practical uses, and later on we'll be joined by cannabis scientist Dr. Zachariah Hildenbrand. And so kick back, toke up, and take a journey to Wonderland with us. Jill, hi, how are you?
Hi.
And welcome to Street Fight Politics. We're happy to have you. You're actually our first guest that we've ever had on the show.
Well, I'm honored. Thanks, Jimmy.
Well, guys, around the country, big things are happening in weed.
Oh, my.
Let's just talk about the status and progress of legalization. Harry?
So, it is really amazing to watch the progress of weed legalization across the country. I would never have thought this would happen 15, 10, maybe even 5 years ago. But it starts, the camel gets its nose in the tent with the medical marijuana, and people get used to it. They get their licenses. They use it legally, at least at the state level. And then they get past the idea that this is some terrible thing that we were all taught back in the 1970s, and realize that, you know what, there's actually a reason for this stuff. It does work. It does work very well, as we're going to learn later in the show, on both physical and mental problems. And it's much safer than alcohol. So, yeah, Arizona, we're talking, I think 30, are there 30 states now with laws?
No, well, actually, medical marijuana is legal in every state in Washington, D.C., except for two, Nebraska and Idaho. Mm-hmm. That's it. Every place else has medical marijuana available, on some basis. And, with Arizona now going recreational, we're getting to the tipping point where all we need is two of the larger states like Texas and Florida go recreational, and it's a done deal.
Right, and we had, big news this week. The House of Representatives passed a national marijuana legalization act. Now that, of course, will go to the Senate where Mitch McConnell lives, so I don't know how far it will get in this. But this is the beginning. This is the first time ever that a national body has voted to legalize marijuana, decriminalize it, remove penalties for people who have been convicted of marijuana crimes, and expunge their records. So this is really big news. But as you say, it's the big states. One of the early states to legalize was California, and they have done a terrific job of not doing very well, but selling a lot of pot. And, Ed, you were talking about the weed market in California?
Well, I mean, you have to compare the weed market between California and Oklahoma, which are diametrically opposed, and how the states approach it. California was we're going to tax the hell out of it and regulate it like crazy. And so they set the taxes so high that they actually benefited the black market. And so instead of, people coming in from the cold, and paying so that they could be legal, there's, such a difference between black market and legal pot that for somebody that's more than a casual user, there's a real financial incentive to stick with the guy that you've been buying it from probably for the last few decades anyway. You go to Oklahoma, and their legislatures really backed into this. They had tried to set this up so that they were going to be legal only. In fact, there is no regulations for legal recreational, but the way they wrote the law is that there's no enforcement mechanism. And so they are now the Wild West, where there are currently 5,000 active dispensaries in Oklahoma. In fact, that's one for every 700 residents. And
no limit on licenses there.
And no limit on licenses. There is, the only limit is you have to have lived in Oklahoma for 2 years. So you get around that, find a partner that's been there, put their name on the license, pay $2,500. You're up and growing. That's it.
Ed, what does the tax structure look like there in Oklahoma? I mean, I assume there's at least a sales tax or something.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to have to ask Zach about that because I'm not up on that. But
I think it's pretty modest in comparison to other
it's
states.
very modest. It's very modest. So it's again, it's one of those things that why should I take a chance on getting busted, for buying something on the black market when I can go in, pay sales tax and, I'm perfectly legal, at least at the state level.
So back before I used marijuana, which I do now for the past year, but back before that, part of my conversion was the fact that it seemed like an easy way to knock out the drug mafia from selling. I mean, because that's their biggest drug crop. I mean, their biggest cash crop, right? And if you could sell it legally, then that would take that away from it. But if you do it like California did, then that doesn't really obviate that, does it?
No, it doesn't at all.
Well, and then the legalization that has happened because of federal law, though, has encouraged the mafia to come back in because it doesn't allow, the federal government doesn't allow weedrepreneurs to do banking, to open up accounts.
There's
banks.
A lot of stuff that are impediments. You can't ship across state lines. Even to, you can't ship from Oregon to California, which are two states that is legal. You have no way to bank. So everything is done in cash, which is a real problem when, you might have $250,000 of cash sitting around, in your dispensary. Come back to what Mike was saying. There's a long, long history of anecdotal evidence that cannabis has a lot of stuff in it that is going to have huge impact on health. And this isn't new. It's actually, when you go back and look at the history, it's been recognized for literally thousands of years. And so that's actually the thing that was drove myself and Dr. Hildenbrand, and our venture, looking at ways that we could, take the molecules in cannabis like they did back, 100 years ago with opiates and, bring them into, the light.
Jill, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the cannabis business and kind of where you think the industry should go?
Well, a lot of what Ed was just saying, the medicinal benefits, I think something Harry touched on a few minutes ago, which was that, to take the place of alcohol. And that's really something that a lot of people have been overlooking all these years, is that not just alcoholism, but, opioid addiction is rampant in this country. And cannabis, marijuana, obviously, is the form of cannabis that we're talking about, has a lot of benefits. And there's so many different types of strains, if you will, that are good for all different kinds of ailments. So really what we need is as legalization spreads and as the stigma becomes less and less of an issue, then I think people start to realize, okay, this can really help me with my pain, with my anxiety, my insomnia, my, all kinds of disorders and you don't even have to get high. There's strains that have just enough THC in it to activate what's called the entourage effect, which is when you have all the cannabinoids from the plant, including THC active in the medicine, then they work better together. Kind of like if, it was a group of people trying to lift a boulder, if they're all lifting the boulder, then it's easier. So the entourage effect works the same way on the human body. And so if all the cannabinoids, including THC, are in there, then it just works better. And you don't need a lot of THC to have the benefits of the other cannabinoids. So, the research that Ed is doing is really fascinating because there are a lot of cannabinoids that haven't even been discovered potentially.
Well, I want to take this up more, but I want to wait until we bring Dr. Hildenbrand in because, he'll be able to expand on this greatly.
But I do want to ask about the environmental benefits of using hemp products versus traditional products to manufacture goods and services, or to manufacture goods, I guess.
Yes, thank you. So actually, it's not commonly known that, or it's becoming more commonly known, but hemp is actually a cousin to marijuana. They're both forms of cannabis. Hemp is currently stated by the federal government to be any cannabis 0.3% THC less. So when I talked about, there's a lot of strains that have nominal amounts of THC where it won't even get you high. Those are still for medicinal uses, and that's where the CBD comes from. You see that on the market everywhere. But the hemp plant itself, there's also strains that actually can be grown for the fiber, and the fibrous material of hemp is actually one of the strongest natural fibers in the world. And so there's uses for insulation. You can actually use the hurd from the stalks for insulation. It's actually a fire retardant and heat temperate material. So you can use it in areas where, fires are an issue. Like California, they're rebuilding using a lot of hemp wood and hemp insulation. Hempcrete, it's actually building material. It's actually like concrete, but it's actually made out of hemp.
Instead of the fiberglass that they would put in some concretes to make them stronger, they use hemp.
I just want to point out that anybody that's tried to keep a joint lit will tell you it's fire retardant. So I totally get that.
That has something to do with how you roll, I think.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of industrial uses for hemp as well. People don't know that before Prohibition, hemp used to be what all the rope was made out of. All the rope on ships and industrial rope is all made out of hemp. And,
yeah, two little historical facts. As I sit here less than 20 miles from Mount Vernon, George Washington, when he died, was one of the largest hemp growers in North America. The other thing is, if anybody who's ever been to Fort Riley, Kansas, a big Army training base in eastern Kansas, will tell you that hemp there grows absolutely out of control. It's terrible to smoke, apparently. I wouldn't know, but I can tell you that it's there, and it was put there on purpose to grow hemp for manila ropes during World War II. It was meant to do that.
The whole plant is beneficial. Not just the stalk, the seeds, obviously very high in protein, omega-3 and 6 fatty acids. I mean, the benefits are huge just from eating the seeds, but also the roots themselves. They actually detoxify the soil, so they actually absorb toxins and metals from the soil. So, in fact, a little known fact that after Chernobyl, they actually planted thousands of acres of hemp around the Chernobyl disaster to absorb the toxic radiation from the soil, and it's working. It actually sequesters the carbon in the plant, so we can use on land. There's some statistic around only 6%. I feel like it's very low of available farmland currently, and it's shocking how little land there is right now that we can actually still use because of all of the chemicals that we've previously used in farming. And hemp doesn't require and killed. So we can plant hemp and use no pesticides to grow it. And then we can harvest it for thousands of products. And then while it's growing, it's actually healing the soil. So then you can actually rotate that out and then use the land for other crops as well.
Terrific environmental concerns. Now, I understand one of the problems with hemp production is the requirements for such a low level of THC in it that it's very difficult to grow with such a low level of THC.
Yes, that's correct. So there's a lot of comments that have gone on. Actually, the USDA, when they put out their interim rule, which stated the federal guideline of the 0.3% THC, they actually opened it up to comments, and there were thousands of responses by independent hemp growers and hemp companies, people who wanted to grow hemp and use hemp products, but the strains that have 0.3% or less are so few and difficult to keep below that. Factors like environmental conditions can actually change. So if you grow it in a really hot area, then it could just raise the THC, even if the strain itself was supposed to be low. And so then you end up with a whole harvest that is technically marijuana, and there's been instances where the DEA has come in and actually burned hundreds of acres.
Well, it's actually more than just instances. Most of last year's hemp crop in the U.S. was lost because it was hot. That's the industry term, is when it's over 0.3, it's called hot. And I mean, from the grower standpoint, they've spent all this money to raise the hemp. Then they can't even destroy it because the DEA comes in. You have to hire a special company that comes in and destroys it in a very specific way. So your costs actually go through the roof, for something that literally you cannot use. You can't remediate it.
You can't sell it as marijuana.
No,
'cause it's
no.
too low grade.
I mean, you got to remember they're growing this in Texas. A lot of places in the South that currently, you can't. There's no cannabis that's legally grown, and so they've gotten really touchy about that.
Yeah, and there's a big gap between saleable cannabis and hot hemp.
Yes, exactly. So a lot of people don't realize, I mean, if you go to your local dispensary and you're purchasing marijuana to smoke or eat or whatever, the amount of THC, a lot of it is grown in greenhouses, and it's not engineered, but it is, they want more THC in it. So most of the products that are labeled as marijuana have anywhere from 10 to 30%. You're talking about 100 times different, 70 times difference in the lowest amount of THC that you'll even feel any psychoactive effects. So really that 0.3 is just an arbitrary number that the DEA or the federal government said, we don't really want anyone to grow hemp. We don't want hemp.
Right.
So we're going to make it so low and make it so difficult that there's real challenges there. So there's a lot of talk about raising that to 1%, because then that's going to open it up to a lot more strains, or at least the strains that they're currently trying to grow that are then going hot.
I like the problem that Jimmy posed, where you've got this industrial hemp, which might just have a little bit more THC than the government thinks it should, but you can't use it for anything else. It's not smokable. It's not saleable. It's none of that. And then of course you've got the marijuana with the high THC and all the other things that make it medicinally good. But in between that is this huge range where it's useless. And if you try to grow it, and the law says it's too hot, you lose it. So you have no financial incentive. It's a terrible position for anybody wanting to go into growing hemp to be in.
I tell you what, our last venture between myself and Dr. Hildenbrand dealt exactly with this. So why don't we bring him on board, because I'd like to hear his thoughts on this also.
Okay. You want to introduce him?
Yeah, I'll introduce Zach. So Dr. Hildenbrand. Dr. Hildenbrand currently sits as a research professor at the University of Texas, El Paso, sits on the scientific advisory board of the Collaborative Laboratories of Environmental Analysis and Remediation, is a director for Curtis Mathis Corporation, and he also sits on the editorial and advisory board of Cannabis Science and Technology, and has written over 60 peer-reviewed articles that deal with cannabis and hemp. So this is a guy that's recognized nationally and internationally as an expert on this. So it's when you listen to him, you should pay attention. And I'm also glad to call him my friend. So,
well, thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well,
so where should we start?
Why THC? How's that?
Why THC? Well, as the kids would say, it's the good. It's where the actual medicine is. A lot has been made about CBD, obviously, cannabidiol, and its effects as an analgesic, pain reliever, anti-inflammatory. But the effects that THC elicits on the body are far more widespread for people dealing with neurological diseases, metabolic disorders, general pain, rheumatoid and osteopathic arthritis, you name it. There's a little bit of something in there for everyone. What Jill just mentioned there was spot on about the entourage effect. And the entourage effect is kind of seen as a synergistic effect where 1 + 1 now equals 3. So we know that if you isolate THC by its own, and this has been done by GW Pharmaceuticals, and I think the product is called Marinol, it makes people nauseous and anxious, and it's complete garbage. But what we find out is when THC is coupled with a bouquet of various aromatic compounds, such as terpene molecules or other cannabinoids or flavonoid elements, that its medicinal effect is far greater than just on its own. So it's a phenomenal plant. And basically why we've been struggling with this prohibition is very simple. It was taking a chunk out of the paper industry. And so the paper industry engaged lobbyists to basically stigmatize cannabis and hemp use with a lot of these derogatory terms, such as marijuana, which is derogatory against Hispanic populations. Jazz cabbage is a derogatory term against African Americans and their love for jazz music. So, I mean, one of the fights that I'm constantly in is just being consistent with the nomenclature. I mean, let's get away from using a lot of this quote unquote stoner lingo, because this is the new frontier of medicine. We should be talking about it as legitimate medicine, using the correct words and speaking as eloquently as we can, because in order for people to take this industry seriously, we need to get away from the tie-dye and the Cheech and Chong and the Bob Marley, and we need to bring in the MDs and the PhDs that are doing this research that are helping legitimize it.
You know, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's true. I mean, we are all children of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we grew up with those terms and the Cheech and Chong and all of that kind of thing, and there's a certain amount of fun that goes along with it. But the reality is, this is serious stuff, and not just serious medicine, but serious business.
Well, here's the issue: is that on the medical side with Dr. Hildenbrand, we were involved in a corporation called Zed Therapeutics, and we were looking at medical issues. And one of the things that Dr. Hildenbrand and his associates in Oregon found out was that you can take one dispensary's purple haze, analyze the genetics in it, go to another corporation, another dispensary, they've got purple haze, you analyze the genetics on that, and there's almost no overlap. They're completely different. And that's what we found out, that when you go through, and not, in hemp and cannabis, that there's a real mishmash of genetics now. And so, I mean, it's like, the big thing is everybody saying, well, is it indica or sativa? And those are basically worthless terms now, because the genetics have been so intermixed that, it basically, they're not distinguishable anymore.
Yeah, the hybridization is ubiquitous. I mean, when you're growing cannabis, I mean, who doesn't do this with other aspects of their life, where you take something and you want to add something of your own to it? So whether it's a recipe for pumpkin pie, or you're brewing beer, or you're growing cannabis, you're going to do something else to it that's going to put a little spin, because you want to see if you can make it a little bit better. And as a function of that, a lot of people will change the name. So for example, Ed could be growing the strain Northern Lights, and he could say, this is an indica dominant strain. And we know primarily that indica dominants are going to elicit more of a sedative effect. And so you might want to use that at nighttime to help you sleep. You certainly wouldn't want something that's going to be invigorating and keep you up at night, like drinking 4 cups of coffee. That would give someone a poor outcome. So he gives me, he has Northern Lights, he gives it to me, and I'm from Canada, so I call this Canada Lights, and then I give it to my buddy, and then he calls it Canada Cookies, and before you know it, it's called Santa's Cookies. And someone now is saying, oh, this is a incredible sativa that's going to invigorate you for your workouts. No, it's not. This is something that's going to put you to sleep. And so why this is such a prevalent issue is because when people are dabbling in this, they want to have a desirable outcome. They don't want to get nauseated. They don't want to be invigorated when they want to go to sleep, and vice versa. And so a lot of folks that have said, oh, cannabis just isn't for me, is because they were dealing with someone who just wanted to sell them a product, get them out the door, didn't have any interest in educating them. I think the biggest aspect where there's room for improvement here is in edibles. My parents, for example, are in their 70s. They have lots of friends, and they don't want to smoke. They don't want to rub something on their skin, but they are interested in maybe trying a quote unquote pot brownie or an edible. And they've never been advised about how edibles are metabolized and dosing. And so it's a double whammy where, okay, so first time user, they try 10 milligram brownie and it takes 45 minutes to kick in because of the digestion and the metabolism. But when it does kick in, that THC is converted into something that's like tenfold more psychoactive or psychotropic. So it's like smoking 100 milligrams, if you will.
Can you send me the recipe for that, please?
There's plenty. Yeah, there's an abundance.
Well, and there's
So you
plenty
can
of
see
that.
how
Eat
this
a
is-
brownie, it's not working, so you eat another one.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they would have been perfectly fine. They would have very favorable outcome. They would have slept very well through that cheesy Lifetime movie and woken up refreshed. But instead, after 20 minutes, they're like, this crap doesn't work. I'm going to take another dose. And then they've taken too much, and then they might get nauseated. They might have had too much THC in their system, which certainly can elicit, negative effects. And then there's like, no, this is not for me. This cannabis stuff is nonsense. It doesn't work. It's just for a bunch of stoner kids. And that certainly couldn't be further from the truth.
Well,
I think that's a great point. I want to talk a little bit about my introduction to it. I had tried CBD for joint pain 2 years ago, and it worked great. No THC in it. Bought it from a warehouse in California, shipped it through the mail, all legal. And I was amazed at how well it worked, and where nothing else did. And
Great.
So 6 months later, I'm visiting. I've been thinking about marijuana, thinking about the THC aspect of it. I go to visit a lifetime friend. I've known this kid since the first grade. We get together. We're
He's
out
an
on his
adult
back
now,
porch.
though. He's an adult now.
Well, he's definitely he's my age.
Let's just be clear about that.
He looks as old as me. And we're sitting on his back porch, and he pulls out some pot and says, "You don't mind, do you?" And I'm like, "Actually, would you teach me?" And so I had a spirit guide, if you will, to kind of get me through my first night. Yeah. Well, I was readily corrupted. I asked to be corrupted.
Sure.
He didn't try to push it on me. And luckily, he had the blend that was all about relaxing. He had already had a heart attack in his life. He's been using it since we were kids. And it was great. I went to sleep. I slept the best I've ever slept for a while. My blood pressure was down for like 2 days straight. It was fantastic. And so fast forward, I moved to Maryland. I get my license. I found a wonderful place called Tacoma Wellness Center where they are so helpful with that. Do you want to do this? Do you want to have that effect? And I think for people who want to get into this, go someplace reputable, find somebody reputable, and ask for guidance on this, because I think it makes all the difference.
Right. And remember that the brands are all BS.
Yeah, they are.
That's something I learned just from experience. Is the brands are just brand names that they're using to attract you. They're not related to what's in the. I'm glad to have you confirm that. Next time I go to the weed store, I'm going to gloat.
Unfortunately, this industry is a little light on science and very heavy on marketing and propaganda and whatnot, and misinformation. Again, this what we're experiencing over the last couple of years, people regard this as the green rush. So people are just of the opinion, I just have to get a license somewhere with square footage, a couple of lights, pots, and some seeds, and it's going to rain gold bricks. And there's been a lot more money floating around than brain cells, unfortunately. A lot of people have made some horrible, horrible mistakes. And I mean, to the earlier conversation about the hemp space, can you imagine being one of those unlucky individuals where, and we saw plenty of this in the Midwest, you're in Illinois or you're in Wisconsin or somewhere like that, you plant a harvest and here are the rules. And then October 2019, the federal government says, no, we're going to actually enact more strict rules. And to the point where all of this material is no longer compliant. So you have a permit to grow hemp, and now you're no longer compliant with that permit. So you can't sell it as cannabis. You're in a no-win situation. So it's been very, very poorly regulated. It's poorly understood. And, coincidentally, some of the proponents of these legislation, like the Banking Act that was passed, which Mitch McConnell, right? And lo and behold, Mitch McConnell, his sons, what industry are they in Kentucky? The hemp business.
Do tell.
Yeah. So it's just like anything, political is you have to grease the wheels, and nobody does the right thing out of the kindness of their heart. You have to find their primary motivation. And so With respect to the conversation you guys have been having about legalization, I was a firm believer. I would have bet a lot of money that Donald Trump was going to throw that out there in kind of a last ditch Hail Mary, like, we're going to do this and we're going to raise so much tax revenue and we're going to have the best economy ever, trust me. He didn't do that. And, but I don't think it's very far off. I think it's just a matter of time.
So
And
Zach,
it's like
what I would like to know,
like other regulated businesses, but it's also really different because we have basically delegated law making to the Drug Enforcement Administration, whose motives have always been prohibition.
Yeah.
So the exact situation you are talking about comes because we allow the Drug Enforcement Administration, which for my money has never been any good for anything, to willy-nilly change these rules whenever they choose, and to say in the same week that Congress passes a legalization bill that they are not going to remove marijuana from the schedule that puts it in the same category
The reason
as morphine.
There's a lot of financial incentive by a lot of players to keep things just the way they are.
I think
it's
right,
more than
Ed.
that.
So,
I think it's putting these moralistic folks in charge of drug policy.
They're
It's
just
both
the
things.
tools. They're just the tools. Go
So-
ahead, Zach.
we saw this in the state of Arizona, right? What was it, 2016? Recreational cannabis was on the ballot, and it looked like it was going to pass. But who was putting the big dollars behind the no vote? And that was the pharmaceutical industry in the sector. And that particular pharmaceutical entity was actually in the business of making synthetic cannabinoids. So obviously a conflict of interest there, in my opinion. But you're right. They're just protecting their interests. They want to sell more opioids. They want to sell more heavy drugs because cannabis not only is taking a chunk out of the alcohol business, it's taking a chunk out of the pharmaceutical meds. And but what we're going to see here is as soon as it goes federally legal, there's going to be million square feet, state-of-the-art R&D facilities equipped with 100 people with resumes like mine that are just crunching out unbelievable science. And, it's going to be like a light switch. It'll be like, nope, this is the devil's lettuce on Tuesday, but on Thursday, this is the new frontier of medicine. Look at what we're doing.
I think that's a new frontier, right?
Yeah, I want to get into what are the benefits. Why would the drug companies be afraid of this? What can happen? What are we suppressing and not getting by keeping this stuff illegal?
Well, cannabis inherently, in my opinion, is not addictive like other drugs. It doesn't elicit the same kind of molecular response that can drive a serious addiction like opioids and some of these heavier pain meds. As far as what is in there, I mean, if I can go off of experience or you can go off the peer-reviewed literature. I mean, an overdose with cannabis, i.e. having too much THC, is just a nap. That's what you get. If you have too much, you just go to bed. And
That's
other
terrible.
than maybe with the edibles, you can be a little bit disoriented, and you won't sleep well, and you can get anxious. But the combination between various cannabinoids and the terpene molecules, you have bronchodilators in there, so that could be for athletic performance. You have vasodilators, which would explain why when you smoke cannabis that one time, you had a drop in your blood pressure. There are compounds in there such as THCV, which is not psychoactive, but actually triggers the metabolism of fatty acids. So this could be used as a nutraceutical for someone who's trying to lose weight. There's constituents in there that regulate blood sugar. There's constituents in there that help slow down the progression of neurodegenerative diseases. And CBD, for example, has garnered the most notoriety primarily because of CNN's coverage, but you've seen what it does for epileptic children. So, for example, there's one patient that our colleagues in Oregon have been working with, Lenny Young, and she was coming from Alabama, which they actually have a law called Lenny's Law that a bunch of us contributed to, which allows epileptic children to get CBD medicine. But she had an aneurysm in utero, and she wasn't expected to live more than a couple of months. And her family moved her to Oregon to work with a guy by the name of Adam Jacques, who's a world-renowned CBD geneticist. He's one of the forefathers of CBD genetics, him and Christian West in Eugene, Oregon. And She was having, I believe, 25 seizures a day. And as a result of the medicine they have procured for her, she's down to having like 1 or 2 seizures a month. Totally life-changing medicine. She's lived far longer than she was expected. And the physicians are just like, what is this? What did we give? Is it the barbiturates that we gave her? Are these drugs? Like, no, it's cannabis.
And that, now here's the politics of that is because of the federal government, you cannot legally research this right now.
Right,
I mean,
correct.
we were sort of doing a workaround because the corporation we had was registered in Canada, so that was and Canada
You're
was
also dealing
actually
with hemp.
and we were dealing with hemp also, but they they were quite delighted to have us be looking at this. But it's like Zach said, if you have to get the federal government out of the way. Otherwise, until then, this is all going to be anecdotal where we know that there's good stuff that can happen, but you can't actually tease it out and research it and do, find out which molecules do what and make a market for this.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point, and I think you guys touched on this, when it's not regulated properly, it allows the black market to absolutely flourish. So what we're seeing in the legal markets, states like Oregon, California saw this extensively, where there were so many licenses that were doled out. There was complete saturation of product, and it dropped the commodity price down to nothing. So again, one day you're in this space and you're producing top shelf cannabis for $3,800 a pound. And then 6 months later, you're only able to get $700, which barely makes ends meet. And so those people, what they found themselves is, well, I can just go on Craigslist and I can sell this flower in a heartbeat for $2,500. So that's what people were doing. And a lot of people did, I know, and a lot of people didn't even get into the legal game. They just said it's too complicated. It's overly regulated. The taxation is ridiculous.
And we can't use banks anyway, so why bother?
Right.
Yeah, and that's the most ridiculous thing too is the banking aspect of this. I mean, in Oklahoma, for example, there's a couple of banks that will take on clients, but I mean, they're charging like $1,000 fees per month just to hold your account there. I've heard of some entities where they're like it's armored guards to take your cash to a bank or a storage facility. Because again, it's all cash. And one in this presentation, someone asked like, well, what happens if you're held up and you lose your cash? And those people literally said, we don't have insurance for this. So it's just the price of doing business.
I haven't been to a dispensary that wasn't a fortress.
Hang on for a second, Harry. We're getting a ton of comments from our Facebook comment feed.
Great.
If you have a question that you would like to ask Dr. Hildebrand, put it in there, and we will be happy to pass it along. Excuse me, Harry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I haven't been to a dispensary that wasn't a fortress, with armed guards and steel vaults and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty impressive, and just the infrastructure alone has got to be through the roof.
Yeah, it's the most heavily regulated industry in the United States right now, and there's huge capital expenditures that need to be made just to get into the game, and then you couple that with the fact that you're taxed out the wazoo for operating your business, and you don't have the same tax write-offs that you can make in a traditional business. It's a very tough game. So that's why you've seen a lot of these publicly traded companies come out with crazy valuations just based on the square footage they had for their cultivation facilities. But, based on everything else and their inability to perform, their stock prices have tanked. That seems to be coming back now. I mean, this last week, stock prices have come up as a result of the recent news that I think, federal legalization passed through. I think it was either the House or the Senate.
House.
But chances are it's not going to get through the other side of government there. So we might be waiting a little bit longer. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what Biden and Harris do.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
the hemp side too also is the same thing. So, even though the federal government allows hemp to be grown now in the United States, you still can't, even as a CBD company, you can't bank. Even if it is hemp, even if it isn't a product that contains any THC at all, it's
Yeah.
really frowned upon. Like in Arizona, there's only like one bank that will even bank with you. I mean, it's complete bullshit. You know, you're just creating a product. You're making shirts that are made out of hemp, and you have trouble finding a bank. You know, I mean, one of my products is soap, and it's crazy. And then advertising too is the same thing. Like they really
Yeah.
frown upon it, Facebook and all the other platforms. So it's really needs to be reeled in by the federal government for sure.
Yeah.
We've got one guy that says he's been in the addiction field for 30 years, and he was just noting the amount of ignorance, and I can't agree more. I mean, that was one of my particular interests, is looking at the use of cannabis to treat pain and also to treat addiction. And I have come to the conclusion that our models for addiction are completely wrong and are going to have to be completely reformulated. One of the things that really impressed me is when you do scans of the brain of somebody in pain and they get morphine, this one little area of the brain lights up. When you do this, the problem is that just when you analyze the brain for how many areas light up when you're in pain, there's 25 separate areas. Now, when you give somebody marijuana, cannabis, all 25 areas of the brain are affected by the cannabinoids, which, you know, and again, we don't know which is doing what, but I think that that's pointing to the fact that, you know, we're going to be treating addiction and pain very differently, you know, hopefully sooner than later.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? So we're kind of crawling out of the primordial ooze here of the Cheech and Chong era, and we're trying to understand more about how the body responds to the cannabis constituents. And yet in this last year, now we're already moving on into psilocybin and psychotropic mushrooms, right? And how those are going to be used to treat various neurological disorders, PTSD, depression.
PTSD is a biggie.
Yeah. So I don't really understand why we're doing that. I mean, we're kind of like just kind of glossing right over cannabis and going straight into mushrooms, maybe because that's how we work and we got to go to the next topic because we don't have the attention span, or maybe that's the flavor of the week. But there is so much.
Or because it takes 50 years. Because it takes 50 years to accomplish what you want to accomplish in this environment.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, you know, Dr. Ed has said this a number of times. I mean, cannabis is like opium in the 1900s. I mean, they didn't know what opium did, what was in opium, all the various natural products. They knew what it did to individuals when you ingested it. But the same lies here for cannabis. You have thousands of different natural constituents, and we're just scratching the surface here of figuring out what each individual one does, what they do in concert with one another. But, you know, from what we've seen early on in literature, there's a little bit of something for everyone here.
I'm going to chime in here with Amy Sherwood. That pain relief was what it was for me. That's how it started. And I was amazed at how well it worked. And then going from using it topically, CBD topically, to using, you know, actually smoking a cannabis for the THC effect, it made a huge difference in my life. And I can't believe that I haven't had access to this for the first 54 years I was around.
Well, you have an endocannabinoid system in your body that's naturally occurring. You don't have an opioid system in your body. So there's reasons why cannabis works so well on so many disorders, because our bodies welcome it and they don't reject it. So there's no side effect. And that's why, you know, for lots of different things, there's all these, you know, Xanax or all these different medicines that people use for all different kinds of ailments, that your body ultimately is like, what is this? But that's not the way with cannabis.
That's an interesting point, Jill, because the endocannabinoid receptors are the most common receptor in your body. Mm-hmm. And which, I mean, to me, I just learned this just recently, and that just astounded me. And you're exactly correct. Opiate receptors are very limited in where you find them, you know, primarily in the nervous system. So, you know, again, that points to why I think that our pain models are wrong. And I mean, it's like the biggest thing I can think of that points to that is, you know, everybody's heard the apocryphal story. The guy breaks his leg playing football and then plays 3 more quarters, you know, and then attributes it to, you know, to endorphins. Well, I put to you, it's like if I give you a big shot of morphine, what's it going to do to you? It's going to put you to sleep. It's going to make your reflexes go to hell. So I put it to you that what's really happened is that there's been a tremendous release of endocannabinoids, which actually do suppress your awareness of pain while not making your reflexes go totally to hell.
So there you
That's
go.
interesting. That's a very interesting thing. And these
Bo
cannabinoid
Jackson, when he
receptors
almost
are
severed
like
his femoral artery there playing football, maybe he just had the most effective endocannabinoid system.
Now, that also brings one thing that I want to segue to is that I think there's an important political issue that may be taking place in Georgia. Because if both senators from the Democratic side are elected, you're going to find cannabis normalization legislation passed almost immediately.
And without them, it won't be, because Mitch McConnell said so.
Right.
And
It'll be the difference.
You're 100% right. This race in Georgia, where probably very few listeners, if anybody, live, is going to be the difference between moving forward with cannabis legislation and not.
Yeah, well, I think it's an ecosystem, right? So we all have to do our part. I mean, I'm trying to do my part by bringing, more of the scientific knowledge to the forefront and distill it down into a simple context that shows the value. I think because we are so focused in our society about athletes and movie stars, I think they could do us a tremendous service by destigmatizing it. Even a simple, advertisement with a guy like Ryan Reynolds, who he's Canadian, so he's into cannabis medicine. Even him showing, hey, this is what I do throughout the day, and I wind down using cannabis, I smoke, and then I go straight to bed, and then I wake up and I work again. Something like that, I think, could be immensely powerful to the general populace to say, yeah, this stuff isn't about wearing tie-dye and watching Cheech and Chong movies and getting stoned and eating a whole bag of chips. There are a lot of working professionals that use this as a performance tool. So life is hard. I mean, I've got feral children that are all over me 24/7 here. So I need to sleep. And when I do sleep, I need it to be a restful sleep. Some people might smoke or take cannabis or hemp before working out because they have a lot of joint pain, and that allows them to get through the workouts and advance their fitness. So I think there needs to be a lot more efforts in destigmatizing it. And I really cringe when I see a lot of these Netflix documentaries that are out there, and it's just a bunch of, I don't know what you even call them, maybe derelicts.
We call it BS.
Well, yeah. I mean, and maybe it's just my perspective, but I want to see people in white lab coats. I want to see their perspective on this, and I think professionals.
And Suzanne Bond put up a question: is legalization going to disincentivize medical study? And I think that once you legalize it, it's going to cause the medical side to explode. It's like Dr. Hildenbrand was saying, like you're going to see $10 billion drop in from pharmaceutical companies, with thousands of postdocs, put in, because here's the numbers. It's like Dr. Hildenbrand had talked about opium. Well, there was a naturally occurring compound in opium called piperine, which they have known about since 1880. The problem is that while it was effective, you had to take a pill 12 times a day because it was so short acting, which means that it's not useful. I mean, it's like I could barely take one pill a day. The company called Boehringer Ingelheim in 1960 added a methyl molecule to piperine, making verapamil, which then became a licensed ethical medicine that generated over $50 billion in 1970s money. So, those are the incentives that you're going to see why people want to get into this, because they want to get the next molecules, that are coming from cannabinoids, and get them licensed as medicines, because the profit potential is, mind-boggling.
There certainly is a subpopulation of individuals that want to smoke cannabis just to get away from the world and relax and maybe watch Netflix and hang out. And that's totally fine. That's certainly within the recreational application. But I think that there is therapeutic value to just doing that. But I think what's going to happen here is the pharmaceutical industry is going to look at developing targeted medicines that are cannabis and hemp derived. So they're going to come out with a new heart drug, and they're going to come out with a new osteoarthritis drug. They're going to come out with probably a new erectile dysfunction drug. Whatever you can think of, they will come out, and they will want to discover new molecules as well in terms of drug targets to do that. So I would love to see in my career there be a federal entity providing grant funding to do this type of research, as opposed to just leaving it to the pharmaceutical industry. But I don't know if that's going to come to fruition.
Well, let me ask you, before we go, Dr. Hildebrand, is there one thing that you think is the big thing that's on the horizon for this research, or two, or, what's the thing you're really looking forward to happening?
Oh boy.
In terms of
medical
treatments or medical benefits or something like that.
Yeah, so what I'm primarily looking at is a lot of the research has been done in murine models, which is mice. And, I've done a lot of my research working on drugs for chronic myeloid leukemia in mice. And mice are interesting. They're certainly an available model, but the murine metabolism is substantially different than a human metabolism. So what I would like to see is it being open up to human subjects ingesting these various cannabinoids or terpenes or flavonoids, and then doing an analysis to figure out how that affects the body. That's how we're really going to know, because there generally can be a lot of loss in translation when you go from what does this do to mice to what does this do to primates, and ultimately what does this do to humans. And I don't think that you're going to have difficulty finding individuals that will participate in that research.
Or already are.
yeah, exactly. So I think that's the next big thing.
Well, and that also points out that, I've been involved in the political legalization here in Arizona, going out and advocating. And, one of the things that was thrown in my face is, well, we don't know, if there's any side effects from long-term use. And the thing is, humans have been using cannabis for probably over 30,000 years. Which means that we've been doing, according to the FDA, a phase 1 and phase 2 trial that's over 30,000 years long. So, if there were, lethal side effects, we would have known about them. And the thing is, when you look at the history of opium, the Greeks 5,000 years ago knew that opium could kill you. And so humans have known all about opium literally for thousands and thousands.
Yeah, that's a moot point, quite frankly. I think McKesson, for example, who's gotten in a lot of trouble for over-prescribing opioids to people in like West Virginia and to completely destroying communities there. They clearly know on the technical front that extended use and over-abuse of their drugs have deleterious effects long-term. Mm-hmm. Yet they're still doing it. So for someone to say, well, you just don't know what it's going to do to you in 5 years. And then you could show that person 5 years of data and they, well, no, you really need to see 10 years of data. And then they just keep moving the goalposts. So there's going to be a lot of people that this just isn't for them. And maybe it takes cannabis to positively impact one of their loved ones' lives. Maybe they have an epileptic niece that then is now on cannabis and extends her life for 20 plus years. Again, people are, I don't want to say people are stupid, but people, when they get fixated on their, and I guess it's about confirmation bias. I mean, they have their mind made up and then they try to find information that fits their narrative. They're not willing to listen to what anyone else has to say. I've had this conversation actually recently with a gentleman, and he was just saying, well, it's just all weed and everyone just gets high and there's no medicinal value. And I spoke to him for 15 minutes about the various classes of molecules. And he just said, yeah, well, it's just weed and it just gets you high. And it's just like, is your hearing aid on? Like, are you listening to what I'm saying here? So you're not going to be able to change everyone's mind on it. But again, I really do think because people listen to a Ryan Reynolds more so than they listen to a Zach Hildenbrand, that if they had, more of these prominent individuals helping destigmatize it, I think we make a lot quicker progress.
Well, I certainly, I appreciate you being here, Zach, and helping us destigmatize it a little bit on this show.
It's a
Yeah,
tremendous pleasure. I always enjoy talking about the new frontier of medicine, and obviously, I've heard quite a bit about your guys' show, and it's a real sense of pride for Dr. Ed. So happy to participate in this. I'll be glad to come on again.
Well, this has been
count
just a
on that.
terrific show, and I'm hoping we can have you back. I know Ed wants to have you back, and Mike or Harry wants to have you back. I want to have Jill back too. I think she has a lot
I
more
want to have
tell
Jill
us,
back and lead us through all the products that she's been working with.
Jill,
Thanks.
how can people follow you or get in touch with you?
Well, my YouTube channel is Jill Knows Hemp on YouTube, and talk about destigmatizing cannabis. That's my goal, is to really put information out there that's accessible to anyone. If you have an aunt or a grandma or a friend or a sibling or anyone who's kind of curious, then they can go to Jill Knows Hemp on YouTube and check it out. And it's really accessible, and I hope that I'm able to give people good information. So, thanks for having me.
And Dr. Zach Hildebrand, how can people get in touch with you if they need to?
You can just reach out to me on LinkedIn or Zach at informenv.com. That's my consulting firm. I'm no longer on Facebook because I got tired of putting out Ed's fires. So,
So you telling, buddy?
So did Facebook.
you could reach out to me mostly through LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive there.
Well, thank you. And for all of us at Street Fight Politics, this has been one of our best shows so far, action-packed, and I learned some things about marijuana, which I didn't think was possible. We'll see you next week, and we won't be stoned, or we might be, but we hope to see you back then here at Street Fight Politics. Thanks for watching.
Take care.
Hey, thanks, guys.